So welcome to the section of our interdependence course, welcoming Rob Hopkins, who, will you speak a little bit about who you are and what you do to begin with? That would be lovely, yeah, so thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, my pleasure. Thank you. Well, hello, I'm Rob Hopkins, and I am the founder of the Transition Network and the Transition Movement, which started here in Totnes, which is about communities coming together and organising to build resilience. And my roots are in permaculture. I was a teacher of permaculture for a long time and natural building and that kind of thing. And I've spent the last 2 years doing a project which is writing a book about imagination, and that's really what I want to share here today. And yeah, I think that's probably all you need to know about me, really. I have a blog, robhopkins.net, if you want to find out anything else. And I wanted to start by showing a picture of my wife being arrested by the police. Woo! Which is not something that she does on a regular basis, but this was the first time, and she actually got arrested 3 times as part of the Extinction Rebellion stuff up in London. And so I just really kind of show this just to get across the point that we are in the time of a climate emergency, and the need to respond and the need to act and the need to rethink everything is really, really profoundly urgent. And if people like her are putting themselves up repeatedly to get arrested, that really is an indicator of where we've got to, I think. And so I want to share with you 9 what-if questions. And I think you could think of this talk as being like a love poem to those 2 words, what if. And I think they might be the 2 most important words in our language. And so the first one is, what if things turned out okay? Because it often feels to me in a lot of the narrative that is around in terms of climate and things that actually we don't make much space for that idea that actually we could bring about the most phenomenal, historically unprecedented transformation over the next 10, 15 years. And to hold that space to say, actually, what if we did this is really, really vitally important. And this is I show this not because this is the only graph I'll show you, by the way. But I show this because for me it feels like if we're to make the scale of the cuts that we need to make over the next 10, 15 years, and we're able to get down to here by 2040 and be well on the way to this, or even steeper than that, what we need to be doing is telling the stories about this place that create a deep longing for that. That's what we dream of, that's what we long for, is to get to that place. And at the moment, often I think those stories are really missing. That when we say 80% by 2030, what will that smell like? What will that look like and feel like and sound like? What would it be like to wake up at that point? And how do we tell the stories about it that create that really deep, deep, deep sense of longing? So for me, I came to this project about imagination because I kept reading people that I really admire, like Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and people like that, saying climate change is fundamentally a crisis of the imagination. It's a failure of imagination. It's the ultimate grotesque, hideous outcome of Margaret Thatcher saying there is no alternative. And it's what we now see playing out. And there'd better be an alternative, or we end up in the most awful mess. So for me, there's something about, I kept reading them saying that, and I was thinking, well, why? What do you mean? They would say the climate change is a failure of the imagination, and they would move off onto talking about something else, and I'd be left there going, what? That bit, but that was really interesting, that bit about the imagination. So I'd spent this couple of years really looking at what's the state of health of our collective imagination? Where are we at? How do you support and enable a culture to rebuild its imagination? If our imaginations are in trouble, why might that be? And so that's the kind of journey that I'm going to invite you to join me on. Because at the moment, often when we talk about climate, we try and motivate people to get involved and inspire people with the change that's possible. We often start by telling stories like this. And for me, these are stories that sort of shut down the imagination. They're kind of, they're sort of, it feels like there aren't many movements in history that design into their founding story the sense that actually what they're setting out to achieve isn't possible. You know, the suffragettes didn't start out by saying, actually, we want to change this, but actually maybe men are a bit smarter. Or Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a dream, but actually it'll probably be quite expensive and it might have to hold up some commuters and, probably won't work anyway. Actually, do you know what? Maybe let's not bother. You know, so to have designed into the thing that the idea that extinction is inevitable feels really kind of self-defeating to me. Because actually, if we were able to mobilise in an extraordinary way, I think we can still create a future that is quite remarkable. This is an artist called James Mackay, who I'll talk more about later, who draws the future in the most delightful way I've seen anybody do it. Often it's a bit science fiction. He takes places that already exist. This is his idea of Leeds in 2040, and he takes places and he draws into them actually a thing and saying, well, why not? Why would it not be that actually our cities are phenomenally biodiverse and we live alongside nature in our cities, or that we live in cities where food is grown everywhere, and that's part of the urban fabric, part of our kids' everyday experience. That is entirely possible. And for me, when I read the United Nations saying we have 11 years to be firmly, cut our emissions in half and be firmly on the path to zero, when I hear that, it feels to me like, what would those 11 years have felt like if we lived through those 11 years? If we were 12 years away from now, looking back at those 11 years, what would they have been like? They would have been the most phenomenal, empowering, extraordinary time when it felt like anything was possible, and all the support that was needed came in to back that, and we felt part of some incredible momentum, like some of the great movements in history have. So, and how do I know that this kind of thing is possible? Well, because part of what I do in my role in Transition Network is I go and visit places where this is already happening. This is not just some crazy idea that's in my head. So this is a place that I went to in France called Montsartou, which is a town near Nice, about half an hour inland from Nice. And about 5 years ago, the French government said all schools should have 20% of organic food in their meals. And so they said, well, if 20% is better than 0%, why are we stopping at 20%? Why don't we just go all the way to 100%? So now in all the schools in Montsartou, all the food is 100% organic, and 70% of that food comes from a market garden on the edge of the town. The municipality bought land that was going to be developed, and they said, no, you can't develop it, we're going to turn it into a market garden. Employs 4 people, they work 4 hectares of land with orchards and greenhouses, and it's just the most fabulous, fabulous thing. And so when you actually go and you walk around this stuff and you think, well, it works, it's completely common sense. Why would you not have schools supplied with food that come from a market garden on the edge of the town? Just absolutely amazing. And they had this building, I think, which was the old farmhouse, which is now a centre for sustainable food education, where groups of school kids come, they walk around the farm, they pick stuff, they go back, they learn how to cook it. And what I loved was that the kitchen there wasn't a kind of steel and glass Jamie Oliver sort of chef's kitchen. It was like a little cooker, a little fridge, a little worktop and a cupboard. Because he said that's the kitchen most of these kids have in their homes, and that's how we teach them to cook. But seeing in place these kind of things, for me, makes me think that actually this is really, really possible. So I'm going to give you a little activity to do now. You might like to try this at home. So I'm going to show you, might want to get into pairs, so you might have to just maybe sit this one out, or we can do together maybe. So I'm going to show you an object, and it's an object that you see most days in your life probably, and you have 1.5 minutes with the other person to think of as many different uses for that object as possible. All right? They don't have to be sensible, or you don't have to be thinking, but is this commercially viable? Could I patent this? Is this something that I would get on the Dragon's Den? Just really like ridiculous. They can be ridiculous, they can be sensible. You don't have to write them all down, but just keep a list of how many you come up with. All right, and I'll give you 1.5 minutes to think of as many uses as you can. Is that all clear? Mm-hmm. Okay. So your object is a coffee cup. Mm-hmm. Go.
Well, it could be a special sort of form of hot air balloon, where you invert it, fill it with very hot air, and this would give you a little bit of transport.
Very nice.
Or cut pretty shapes out of it and put a nightlight in it for a child.
Very nice. I'm sure the fire officer would have other things to say about that, wouldn't
I was thinking if you cut it that way, what would it be? And there's probably a sort of a holder thing sticking to the wall for things in.
Nice. I did this. Sorry, go on.
Stringing a few together, sort of like decorative lights or something.
Nice.
Paint them.
I did this in Sweden, and this woman said, I would use it to keep the darkness in. Which I sort of had nightmares about for several months. And then somebody said, well, actually, that's not as mad as it sounds, because actually in Sweden you have like at that time of the year where there's daylight all the time. So it'd be nice to have in your house a little space where there was some darkness. I thought that was quite
Or put it on your eyes.
Yeah. So the reason for doing this is this is an exercise in what's called divergent thinking, which is that ability to assemble things in novel ways, things that weren't previously assembled, bring them together in new ways, and that's one of the things that's fundamental to imagination. And I came across some really interesting research that was done in 2011 by a woman called Kyung-hee Kim, who's a researcher in the US, who looked at this thing called the Torrance test for creative thinking, which is the gold standard creativity test done in the world, which basically does what you've just done. And they've done that going back to the 1960s in big data sets, 30,000 people every year have done this. And what she found in her research was that imagination and IQ rose together until the mid-1990s, and then IQ kept rising and imagination went into what she called a steady and persistent decline, and has been declining ever since. And she, when this was published, it was on the front page of Newsweek magazine. It was a really big story in the US, and people said, my God, what does this mean for economic growth? What does this mean for Silicon Valley and Hollywood? And I never heard anyone in the climate change, social justice world say, well, what does this mean for us? Because fundamentally, if actually what we're seeing is a decline of the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise, which is my favourite definition of imagination, the ability to see things as if they could be otherwise. If that's declining at this time in history, we're really in trouble, because if there was ever a time we needed to be able to see things as if they could be otherwise, it's right now. And so that was what really kind of set me off, thinking, okay, this needs a bit more looking into. So she attributed that decline to three things: to the decline of play, free play, to the rise of screens, and to the rise of testing in schools. So we're going to look a bit more detail at some of those. So my second what if question is, what if play was at the heart of every day? And she says in her thing, actually we're moving into a society now where children are expected to start compiling their CV from the age of 4, and we've lost that kind of creative sort of free play that used to be the case. Everywhere streets were full of kids playing. They had songs and games and rituals and traditions and places and tunnels and dens that adults knew absolutely nothing about at all. And actually these streets have been sort of purged by traffic, and the kids are all inside on tablets, either of the medicinal or the electronic variety. And all of these games and things that went on were really important. They were how kids learned to cooperate, they were how kids learned to manage conflict, they were also how kids learned to take risks. And if we create a culture where kids don't take risks, we produce adults who can't take risks, which is absolutely the last thing that we need again at this time in history, and I think is one of the things that we're seeing that's paralysing us from embracing the kind of changes that we need to make. And so I went off to look at, well, where can we see play kind of rebounding? Is there anywhere where we can see play being really valued? And I went to see this project in Bristol called Playing Out, which is this fabulous charity. And what they do is they help people to shut their streets so kids can come out and play. And the streets, I went to this place in St George in Bristol, where the council have made it really, really easy now. So you don't have to do every single date. You just block out your 40, 50 weekends or whatever times you want to do during the year. You submit them all at once. You have to have a couple of adults with high-vis jackets, and you need to let all the neighbours know, and there's a few things like that. And then you shut the street, and the streets just fill up with kids playing and drawing in chalk all over the streets and skipping games. And I talked to adults who said, actually, we found through doing this that actually we quite liked each other. And now we meet up and we have socials and we do different things together, and the kids are all out, and it was really, really interesting. And the woman who I spoke to, she said, this is what naturally happens when you take the cars out of the picture. It's not like the imagination has disappeared, but when you create the conditions for it not to happen, it just sort of starts to wither. It's like a muscle that should be like that, and it's kind of much more like that. And in Totnes a couple of years ago, we had this fantastic thing called the Street Games Festival up in the Rutherfold, where the Rutherfold was closed one Sunday, and all kids came out to play, and people came out and taught them different games. We had a couple of refugees who were here from Pakistan and Eritrea or somewhere, who came and showed them their games that they play, and it was just magic. And it was really interesting to see the kids for whom learning to play cooperatively was a real struggle, that they had kind of lost that somehow. It was like, why isn't this all about me? This should be all about me. And but it was a glorious. And my favourite game that I saw that day was this game, which is called Spijkerpooper, I think, something like that. It's a Dutch game, which literally means nail poops. And the idea is you have a piece of string and you tie a nail onto the end of it, and you have a bottle, and you tie it around the back of your belt. Do you remember?
Yeah.
You can probably pronounce it properly, can you?
Spikeable.
Spikeable. So, and then you tie it off your belt, and then you have to try and get it into the bottle through the neck. It's fantastic. This girl here was for about 10 minutes. You could have heard a pin drop. If you ever worry about your kids and attention span and they're being too noisy, give them this game, and you actually do it at work. You know, it's a beautiful attention span rebuilding game. It's fantastic. I do this sometimes in workshops with adults. You get them up and get 5 of them doing it together. And especially because adults get very competitive with each other, it's really fun. It was beautiful to see actually how you create the conditions for play to come back. But actually, often these days, what kids get in terms of play is things like this, which actually you're going to be. I'm not quite there yet, and this took a bit of a while to actually find one of these. But this is an actual Hello Barbie, which I found on eBay, and Hello Barbie is one of the most hideous inventions of the last 4 or 5 years. So Hello Barbie was the world's first Wi-Fi enabled doll, and the idea was that you press the button on her. I haven't got it set up yet, so the idea is that it has conversations with your child, and on the box it says this device records extracts of conversations or something. So Hello Barbie will say, "So Rob, tell me about your favourite shops." And then it might say, "Tell me about your family." And then all of the stuff that I replied to the questions is recorded by Mattel. All the questions come from a 280-page script written by Mattel, and they use it to build a detailed marketing profile of your child. And so I want to be able to have it on stage and sort of ask it in-depth questions about the imagination and the erosion of children's imagination, and sort of see the kind of intellectual debate that we're able to have on stage. Anyway, I haven't quite got it set up yet. But these were released in America in 2015, and Mattel thought this was the great new future of toys, particularly because it's a really troubling part of the whole surveillance capitalism thing of hoovering up data from wherever they can get data from. But actually, when it was released, a fabulous organisation called the Centre for a Commercial-Free Childhood ran a campaign called Hell No Barbie to try and get this withdrawn from the market. And I interviewed a guy called Josh Golin there who said, "This is an assault on children's imagination. This will murder your child's whole family of imaginary friends. Give a child a pile of sticks and some leaves and they can create empires and universes and anything. Give them one of these and they don't need to be imaginative at all. It gives them everything that they need to know and doesn't leave any space for anything else." So they ended up, they were anticipating selling 100,000 of these. They actually sold less than 10,000, and it ended up being withdrawn from sale. But I got one. Hours of fun with that. So, but actually in Germany, the German version of it is called Hello Kayla, which is a deeply troubling looking thing, the stuff of nightmares. And actually the German government have classified this, which is basically a different version of that, as illegal espionage apparatus. And parents can actually be fined for turning the Wi-Fi on or putting batteries in it. But we're seeing this kind of co-option of play, this idea that children's play is a fair space for corporate thinking to move into and to sort of monopolise that space. This is an extraordinary man, and I often ask people, "Who's this?" And sometimes people say, "Is it you?" And I say, "No, this is absolutely not me," for the record. This is a guy called Antanas Mokas, who was the mayor of Bogota, and he had been the president of the University of Bogota, and the university had experienced lots of kind of infiltration by loads and loads of FARC rebel students. And when he tried to stand up and give a speech in front of all the students, he got sort of heckled and booed and couldn't deliver his speech. So he said he tried a few times, and then he just mooned the whole hall. Dropped his trousers and mooned the whole hall. And he said, sometimes words aren't enough, and we need other approaches. So understandably, that led to him losing his job. But actually, he used it as a platform to run to become the mayor of Bogota. And he won. And he ran as Super Citizen. He ran as a superhero called Super Citizen. And this was his election campaign. And he said something beautiful about how, politics needs play. That we need to bring play into politics. And he did some amazing things. Like when there was a drought, he went on live television in the shower, showing people how to have a quick shower, and led to a fall in water use of about 40%. He ran an evening called a night without men, where all the men were invited to stay at home and all the women came out and took over the centre of the city, and only the women police were on duty. And my favourite thing that he did was, Bogota had notoriously corrupt traffic police. And so he sacked the entire traffic police department, and instead he hired 400 mime artists who stood on all of the intersections. They had red cards and yellow cards. He said the one thing that Colombians fear more than the law is being made to look silly. So these clown mimes had like red and yellow cards like football referees, and they would show yellow cards to the naughty cars and invite the well-behaved cars in, and made the whole ridiculous sort of play thing on all the big intersections in the street. And he said to all of the traffic police who'd lost their jobs, you can have your job back if you retrain to be a mime artist, which I just thought was beautiful. And it led to about a 50% fall in deaths on the roads in Bogota, and he's really quite an extraordinary guy. One of my favourite things that we have ever done so far in the transition movement was at a conference we ran in 2012. We did an event called Transition Town Anywhere, and Transition Town Anywhere was the idea of people. It was in Battersea Hall, whatever it's called, Battersea Art Centre, in the main hall. And people came into the first little bit, which was kind of you were behind a ribbon, and then we were told that when the ribbon is cut, you're stepping forward into 2030, 2035. And everybody had a blackboard and a piece of chalk, and you went through a series of activities where first you were on your own, then you got together with someone else, then you formed in the street, then you met other people who shared your kind of areas of interest, and then you came up with projects. You formulated an idea of a project that would work in this imaginary town of the future, and then all down the high street, marked out in tape on the floor, were different plots, and this was the high street of Transition Town Anywhere. And then when you had an idea, you would go to the letting office and they would give you a number, and that was your plot. And then up on the stage there was a massive pile of cardboard boxes and bamboo canes and string and sticky tape and pens, and we basically built the high street of the future and lived in it and played in it and inhabited it for a whole morning, seeing 400 adults all playing. It was one of the most extraordinary things. There were banks and well-being centres and food businesses and community energy projects and people coming and going, and how can we trade and how can we work together. At lunchtime, everyone was meant to go off from here and get their lunch. Actually, they all brought their lunch back and had a street party in the middle of the whole thing. It was one of the most magical things, and actually I meet so many people who were there who, when you start talking about it, their eyes kind of fill up and they get all kind of misty. It was a magical thing. And the thing that I was involved in was we started a thing called the Yeast Collective. This is me at the thing, doing the Yeast Collective, which was a bakery and a brewery in the same space. And actually, before the end of this year, this will be becoming a reality. So the brewery that I then, after this, went and started in Totnes, by the end of this year we'll be moving in with a bakery and we'll actually be creating this. And I know it will work because I played it for a whole morning and it was just fantastic. And that kind of dream and that vision of that got so deep through doing that. And I meet lots of people who are at this who have then gone on to do the thing that they played that day. You know, there's something really, really powerful about bringing play into activism and bringing that sense of experiencing something that you can only really do through play. If we play it first, then it becomes much easier to create it in reality. So my third what if question is, what if we considered a healthy imagination vital to our health? So this is a very, very important part of the brain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus actually is like there's two of them, there's one on the right and one on the left. They're like the wishing bone of a chicken. And the hippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for our imagination, for our memory. So when we're being imaginative, there's all different networks that fire, but they all have the hippocampus at their centre. The interesting thing about the hippocampus is that it is the part of the brain that is uniquely vulnerable to cortisol. So when people are anxious or traumatised or stressed, the hippocampus shrinks. And people who have PTSD, their hippocampus can be up to 20% smaller. Same with children who've had very traumatic childhoods. The hippocampus shrinks. And when the hippocampus shrinks, what happens is we lose that ability to look at the future. We lose that ability to look at the future in kind of positive and hopeful ways. Our ability to see things as if they could be otherwise shrinks and contracts. We end up in a space where we're just sort of stuck in the present, or the past, going round and round. And we lose that ability to look up towards the future. And actually, it felt like such a powerful kind of analogy of the times that we live in, where we kind of where we're sort of losing that ability to look up and look forward in kind of hopeful ways. And people talk about how we now live in an age of anxiety, we have an epidemic of loneliness. In many ways, we're living in this kind of perfect storm of things that undermine the hippocampus. And I'll come on to talk about more of those. But I was really interested in where could I find people who are actively working to find creative ways to rebuild the hippocampus, to find ways of bringing the imagination back into people's lives, of people for whom trauma and stress are a very present part of their daily life. And this is an amazing woman in Dundee called Rosalie Summerton, who runs a project called Art Angel that I went up to go and visit. And Art Angel operate out of a first floor office block in the middle of Dundee. They are run by everybody who works there has had some mental health issues during their life. They work with people who either self-refer or are referred, and they are people who've been through the mental health system or who decide they really feel they need it. But their idea is when you come here, you're not a client, you're not a patient, you're an artist who is preparing work for an exhibition. And we're here with all the paints and the brushes and the papers and all the materials you need, and tea and biscuits and a shoulder if you need one, and a safe space in which to do that. They do photography classes, painting classes, and I went up and spent a day, first with the photography class and then with the painting class. So everybody knew I was coming, and I got to talk to different people. One woman said, I've spent the last 3 years in my pyjamas. 6 months ago I came that close to committing suicide, even though I have 2 lovely children. And she said, since I came here, I can see the future again. I can now look up, I can look forward, I can see, and part of the idea is that they help people to imagine themselves in different ways. I spoke to one guy who'd worked in the local authority for years and had burnout and very low self-esteem and stuff, and I said, so do you think of yourself as an artist? And he thought about it for a while and said, aye, why not? So people are kind of reimagining themselves in that space. It's beautiful. Every year they do an evaluation because they're funded by the health board. So rather than giving people an extensive sort of checklist of different things, they give them a piece of paper that has 2 outlines of a human body. And they say, fill the first one in to show how you were before you came here, and fill the other one to show how you were afterwards. And I looked through loads of them, and they're all very similar, but this one really kind of stood out to me as something that just really captured the kind of transition that they take people on. And this feels like the transition we need to find ways to go on collectively, actually. So for the book, I interviewed about over 100 different people. And this is a woman called Donna Rosadis, who's a neuroscientist. And she talked about that. She said that when people feel very anxious, they get into these spirals where they are less and less able to look up into the future, and they seek out negative things that reinforce that spiral, and it just kind of goes down and down and down. That was feeling fascinating to me. And what if we followed nature's lead? What if we were able to draw on nature as the inspiration for a lot of this? We spend less and less time outdoors, more and more time indoors, and actually nature has a really important role to play in this. This is President Roosevelt, the first one, and this is John Muir, who was one of the very first people who we would call an environmentalist. President Roosevelt loved John Muir's books. He read all of his books, he loved them, and he said to the people around him, one day I'd love to go hiking with John Muir. So it all got fixed. And one day he turned up and they spent 3 days in Yosemite, just sort of travelling around, making little campfires. They just had 2 people travelling with them, and they stayed up late every evening talking around the campfire, had these very deep conversations about why nature mattered, why wilderness matters in the culture. And off the back of that, President Roosevelt declared millions of acres of national forest, declared Yosemite a national park, and created the first national parks just from those conversations. And he said in his autobiography just before he died, he said, I shall forever be grateful for those 3 days with John Muir. And there's something about spending time outdoors which really, really helps to connect people to their imagination. But also at the same time, when we live in a time when we know that the biodiversity in the world around us is contracting, that's another factor, I think, that really starts to shut down the hippocampus and narrow our imagination. René Dubos, who was a microbiologist, used to say, if we lived on the moon, our imagination would be as barren as the moon. So if we live in a world where in my lifetime we've lost 70% of the creatures that we share this planet with, living in a world where that is happening has a really kind of corrosive impact, I think, on the hippocampus. It puts us in a state of sort of low-level heartache. And there's a woman who I spoke to called Lise van Susteren who calls it pre-traumatic stress disorder. It's this sort of they notice with soldiers that before they go to war, they experience many of the symptoms that returning soldiers do, kind of in anticipation of knowing that that's going to happen. And I think many of us are in a state of pre-traumatic stress disorder, which is one of the things that is being really corrosive in terms of our collective imagination. And this is one of my favourites. So in the next bit I'm going to talk about what-if questions. But this is one of my favourite what-if questions from London, which was started by a guy called Daniel Raven Ellison, he calls himself a guerrilla geographer. He took his son to visit all the national parks in the UK, and then they came back to London, and he started to map all the different places in London that were green spaces and blue spaces. And he created this map. This is a map of London without any of the houses and without any of the roads, just showing the green spaces and the blue spaces. And he found that when you add it all up, actually London is 49.5% green space and blue space. So you only need an extra 0.5% for the majority of London to be green space. And that's 1 square metre for every person living in London. So the what-if question was, what if London was a national park? What would we do? What would your 1.5, what would you do with your square metre? Would it be at school or work or at your place of worship or in your garden? Where would you do that? And it's such a beautiful question. And actually London will be formally designated a national park city by Sadiq Khan in July. And it's just the most beautiful question because it creates so many spaces for people to step in and say, well, I've got this bit, I've got this bit. It creates an overarching what-if story in which many, many different things become possible. This is one of my sheroes. This is Doria Robinson from Richmond, California, who is a kind of an urban agriculture pioneer there in Richmond. Very, very poor neighbourhood. Lots of guns and gangs and problems like that, and she has created over the last 15 years 13 different farms in different parts of that community. The aim is to grow 5% of Richmond's food through those gardens. Every year they train more and more young people to become those kind of urban food growers, and she's just fabulous. And so I was really interested to talk to her to say, how have you noticed over 15 years this work that you've done, working with people where they're getting their hands in the soil, they're becoming connected with nature, connected with the seasons, creating these projects, coming into these gardens that have been set up and running for 15 years. How have you seen it impact and change the collective imagination of Richmond? And she said, well, when I grew up here, we all just wanted to get out. We all just said, if you stay here, you'll die here, and you don't want that to happen. She said, now I talk to so many people who've gone through our programs who are saying, we want to stay here, we want to raise a family here, we want to start something here. And absolutely, she could see that the work that they had done had had a direct sort of knock-on to the sense of what felt possible in that place. So what if we fought back for our attention? Feels like a really, really important question to me. So I'd like you to imagine that you are in Arles, in France, in 1888, and you're in the kitchen of the Yellow House, and Vincent van Gogh comes into the kitchen carrying a bunch of sunflowers, and he puts them into a nice little earthenware pot on his little wooden table, and then he sits back and he looks at the sunflowers, and then he gets out his iPhone, and he thinks, well, I'll just check my Facebook page, and I'll just check my Instagram feed, and I'll just check my Twitter. Oh, I'll see if I've got any emails. And 2 hours later, he's watching videos of skateboarders falling downstairs. Now, if that had happened, we wouldn't have had this. You know, and all of that work that has so moved and inspired people down over the decades. Because creating something like that requires the ability to be focused and to give our attention to something. And that is an ability which is sharply declining in our society today. You know, our attentions are shattered, and that ability, and I noticed it when I started writing this book. You know, I'd spent the last 4 or 5 years with Transition Network, writing blogs and putting them on the Facebook page and putting them on the Twitter page and then linking them this time, all of that stuff. I sat down to read a pile of books that I needed to read. Page 1, okay, page 2, get to page 3, you're thinking, you know, it's really hard to be able to do. I once read Anna Karenina, for heaven's sake, which is about this thick. You know, I couldn't do that now. And there's this sort of erosion in our culture of that ability to focus on anything is really harmful. And it moves, there's a guy called, I can't remember what he's called, anyway, he wrote a book called The Shallows, where he talked about the difference where now we kind of, our relationship with knowledge is that we kind of water ski across the top, rather than diving deep. And when we have a culture where we don't dive deep anymore because our attention spans don't support us to be able to do that, it really hurts and impacts our ability to be imaginative. And how we do campaigning. We're trying to do campaigning to people who can't keep focused on anything for more than 10 seconds. We have presidents who run the biggest, most powerful nations in the world, whose attention span means that even if you give him a one page, he can't read one page of text unless it's all about how great he is. You know, so this is really, really important, I think. And there's a woman, amazing woman called Sherry Turkle, who writes about the impact that digital technologies are having on our ability to have conversation with each other. An amazing book. She says we are forever elsewhere. You know, we are off and our brains are all over the place. And part of it is because we've lost the ability to be bored. And boredom is that time when our imagination is really calling to us. So you saw my shit phone that I've got that rang earlier on. Part of the reason for getting that was at the end of writing this book and doing all the reading and the research that what people are talking about smartphones and how smartphones are this kind of highly, highly addictive technology that we carry in our pockets that we are evolutionarily unequipped to resist. And behind the smartphone are thousands of people far smarter than us who value our attention far, far more than we value it. And something like a smartphone, how it took a camera and your music collection and your notebook and your calendar and lumped all those things into one device. And so for me, I'm trying to kind of experiment with trying to break those things apart again, and having a phone that's just a phone, and having a camera, and having a notebook, and trying to actually reclaim that a bit has been a really interesting process, actually. So what if school nurtured young imaginations? What if kids left school at 18 with their imagination honed like a superpower? So they came out of school and nothing felt impossible, and everything was like, yeah, I can do that, that's not a problem. You know, they left with having had their imaginations really, really nurtured and invited over the last. Of course, that's not really very many people's experience these days. But I was looking around for, well, where can we find that? We're in a time where governments are actually trying to phase the arts out of education altogether. The English baccalaureate, which is two words which, if you mention them to most teachers who work in the arts, they either look like they're going to burst into tears or punch somebody, has been this hideous kind of devaluing of the arts. We've seen a 39% decline in the number of students taking arts exams at GCSEs. We've seen a 20% fall in the number of art teachers or the number of teaching hours in the arts. It's absolutely as if it's just being driven completely out of the whole process. So I was really interested in finding, well, where are there places, schools that are really valuing the imagination? And everybody I talked to who was doing that talked about this place. Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. This is a place in Italy called Reggio Emilia, where at the end of the Second World War, all they were left with was a kind of a ruined town and a tank and 3 trucks and 6 horses that the Germans left as they retreated. And so the people of Reggio Emilia sold those things and used the money to set up a school. And the fundamental idea behind the school was, how can we create a school that will ensure that fascism never comes back? And fundamental to their idea is at the heart of every school, there is what's called an atelier, a workshop, where you can go at any time and you can make whatever you like, and someone is there to help you make that thing. And so all the schools that are inspired by that work with that same idea. So I spoke to schools in Brazil, near Sao Paulo, in very poor neighbourhoods there, where there's this amazing school, all built around a circus big top, which has a workshop at its heart and is really modelled on that idea. A school in India which is doing the same thing. And they're all based on this idea of they don't teach by subject, they teach by project. So the kids decide a project, the school supports them to do the project, and they learn through projects. And they find this big sort of flourishing of imagination. And actually, just one moment. I did have some notes that I need to refer to, which I didn't get out beforehand, of course. So this is a school in Plymouth, which is called the Plymouth School for Creative Arts, which was founded about 5 years ago. And it's a really, really fascinating place. So there's Plymouth Art College. The guy, Andrew Brewerton, who runs the art college, found that he was having more and more conversations with kids who were coming in and saying, how are you doing? Do you like it here? And they'd say, we love it here. And he said, why do you love it here? And they said, because this is the first creative thing we've done in our whole education. We've spent the last 12 years trying to pass tests and trying to guess what the answer in our teacher's head is, and not being invited to be creative and to come up with things. And so he was like, okay, how could we create a school that goes from 4 to 16, which is designed around an art school? How could we make a school that's like an art school? And originally their idea was that they wanted to do this in an old department store right in the centre of Plymouth. There was an empty department store, and they spent 2 years trying to get the permission to do it in the department store. And in the end that didn't happen, so his brief to the architect was, design us a department store that we can run a school in. It should have no corridors, it should have no rooms that resemble a cell for 30 inmates, it should have studios rather than classrooms. So this is, and it should have an atelier at its heart. So this is where you come in, this is the atrium, and the atelier is a food atelier, so it's where they train kids to cook, and you can go anytime and learn about cooking and to make different things. And this is one of the classrooms. So it's not like the classrooms that we had, they're like studios in an art in an art school. Absolutely beautiful. So I'm not saying that this is that this school will tackle climate change, but I think actually if we really want to have the mobilisation that we need to be making schools that are much, much more like this. We need to be bringing art schools. And what was so interesting was, at the moment, the Department of Education here are obsessed with the PISA scores, which is this international kind of benchmarking test of numeracy and literacy in different countries. And they're obsessed with the fact that China and Southeast Asia way outperform the UK in terms of numeracy and literacy through that. So Andrew was saying he goes to Shanghai quite regularly because they have other colleges there. He says, I talk to people there, I say, well, how do you get such high PISA scores? They say, well, it's no secret. How do you think we get it? But it's no substitute for childhood, And actually what they're fascinated with in China is how, because China is sort of makes stuff, but it's not that imaginative. And culturally, it's about you learn the classics and you recite the classics. It's not a kind of an imaginative culture. So somewhere in the sky above, presumably sort of Qatar or somewhere, are people from the Department of Education here flying out to see how to do what they're doing in China, which is so ruinous to children's imagination, being passed by people from China coming over here to learn how to do education differently. You think, why don't you just meet in the middle and sort of and swap notes?
So that's called the Plymouth School of
Creative Arts. It's down very near where the ferry goes, the ferry to France goes from. So they do amazing things there, like when they study French. They use the kitchen in the school and they prepare meals together entirely in French, and then they go and they get on the ferry to France and they go to Roscoff and they go around the market, and the market are all the traders are instructed not to speak any English to them, and the idea is they buy all the ingredients to cook a meal for everyone back at school, and they buy all the ingredients just talking French. They come back on the ferry, they cook this meal, they serve it to everybody talking in French. It's a very kind of different way that they do stuff, and they see it as a real community resource. So they have a big sports hall upstairs, they have a big dance studio. He talked about how they let the sports studio to the local basketball team, the Plymouth Raiders or whatever they're called. And they said you can have the room for free. In exchange, we want you to come in and do literacy with our 4 or 5-year-olds. He said there's something magical about seeing 6'2" teaching 2'6". So what if our storytelling was able to bring a positive future to life? How can we, if there is the potential still to create something extraordinary in the future, how do we become the best storytellers of that we can possibly be? And this is a couple at Plymouth University called Jackie Andrade and John May. And they've done this research where they've developed something called functional imagery training. And functional imagery training works with people who have addictions or behaviours they want to change, and it works with them to develop a really strong mental picture of the future when that behaviour has changed. So it might be using the imagination in a multi-sensory way. So the imagination is not just visual, we can imagine smells, we can imagine sounds, we can imagine sensations and feelings. So they say, imagine, for example, you're out and you're running and you feel fit and it works and you can run and you're not totally out of breath all the time, and you're running and you can hear the bird song and you can feel the light changing as you run under the trees, or feel what your body feels like when you step out of the shower for the first time and you've just exercised, or you're able to get down and play with your grandchildren for the first time and really play on their level. How would that feel? And build up that mental picture. And what they found is incredible kind of results where people make the change and then they stick with the change and they continue the change. Most weight loss programs, after 6 months, everybody goes back and puts about 50% of it back on, and they don't have that at all. They talk about creating memories of the future. was a term that really stuck out for me. How do we help people create memories of the future that create a longing? How do we create that longing for where we want to get to? And their research really sort of showed that was possible. And this is the guy James Mackay, whose drawings I showed you at the beginning. This is him in Leeds, where he goes and sits out somewhere and he starts to draw what he can see in front of him, and he stops passers-by and says, how do you think this place might be in the future? What could this place be like? And then he draws in their ideas and their dreams for the future. He says all you need is a very rough sketch. That's all you need in order to start those conversations, that you can start to kind of people it and populate it with ideas and different things like that. Beautiful. And I love that idea of how do we give people a sense of what the future could be like. So this is very literal. The future will look like this. It could look like this. With your ideas, it could look like this. But also, how do we communicate what it would feel like? What would it feel like if we manage that in the next 11, 12 years to be waking up in those times where we know that the momentum has shifted and the tectonic plates have shifted and we're moving in the right direction? And one of my favourite examples of this is by Quentin Blake, the illustrator who I just adore. And when I was a kid, I used to do a programme called Jack and Ori on the television, where he used to tell stories to the camera. And he would just start with a blank wall and a pen. And he'd go, there was a boy who was called Jack, and he lived up in a house on top of the hill with his... And I was like, I just fell in love with drawing, watching that. And so he was commissioned by a maternity hospital in Angers in France to do 50 murals that were going to go on the walls in the maternity hospital. And he talked about them as being a celebration of what's going to happen and a reassurance that that's what's going to happen. So when women arrive in the hospital feeling very anxious, they're met with these different pictures. There's just a few of them. Isn't it beautiful? And he said that when he was halfway through the project, he got called in for a meeting with the administrator, a very serious administrator guy, and he said, oh God, are they going to tell me the budget's run out or there's some problem or something? And the guy said, what's most important is the exchange of looks between the mother and the baby. But these don't say, your birth will be like this, and break it down. It's just, it gives you a sense and a feeling and a kind of a connection in that way. So what if we started asking better questions? Like I said before, I think those two words, what if, are so powerful. And when you see people framing projects around what if questions, it's fantastic what gets created. So in Tooting in London, Transition Town Tooting are one of the most imaginative transition groups. They do just the most fantastic projects. And in Tooting, they have nowhere which is like a square or a village green or a sort of a shared space for the community. They have a busy high road, one of the main highways through London, lots of shops, but nowhere that's like that. But there is one place where it could be, which is here, which is normally a bus turning circle. So this is normally full of buses with their engines idling, waiting to be called off to different places. So the air is terrible, the people who live in these houses, the air quality is awful, and it just doesn't really work. So Transition Town Tooting did a day called the Tooting Twirl, where they took over that space and said, what if this was our village green? And they not only asked the question, they kind of inhabited it as though that was the case. They even put grass down on the ground. And there were flowers and plants and music and food and the smell of coffee and conversation. And what was most interesting, I went up for the day, was how the conversation changed during the day. You'd hear people's conversations. They start out saying, if this was our village green, if this was our village green. And about halfway through, it starts to change to when this is our village green. When this is our village green. It's just like there was something changed in the sense of what was possible and in what people gave themselves permission to think would be possible. And I got to take my shoes and socks off on the green grass of Tooting on a summer's day. And part of that when question was, people started to look at, this is a big Primark store. Nobody ever stops to look at the wall of Primark. You're just walking past. And I noticed several people saying, when this is our village green, what will we paint on that wall? What story about ourselves do we want to tell on that wall? And you could tell that the sense of permission and possibility shifted during that day. It hasn't happened yet, but they talk about how it now has a kind of air of inevitability about it, because people, again, like the Transition Town Anywhere thing, people got to play it for a day, and it became a reality for them. These are two of my favourite people. This is Dan Edelstein and Hilary Powell. Hilary is a printmaker, and Dan is a filmmaker, and they live in Walthamstow in London. And Walthamstow, like many parts of London, has been experiencing many of the impacts of austerity, and part of which was that their local bank shut down. Their local cooperative bank closed. So they did a project where they took over the bank and they turned it into what they called an act of citizen money creation. So they brought in screen printing and block printing and gold foiling, and they started printing these banknotes. Now these aren't a local currency, these are sort of limited edition artworks that are all hand signed, printed on one side. On the back there's a stamp and it's signed by the bank manager, who is Hillary. And their aim was they called it an act of citizen money creation. And when I went up there, it was just magic. There was people screen printing and cutting, and all these people making different things. They paid everybody who worked there the living wage to do the work on it. And all the notes were then hung up on these washing lines through the building. And they talked about how people came in and said, "This smells like what my dad used to smell like when he came back from work." There's something really evocative about making things, tangible things with real things, rather than just starting an online campaign. And so their aim was that they wanted to produce these different notes. And the different notes had 4 different people on them. So these are the 2 Steves who run a project keeping young men out of gangs. This guy is called Gary, who mortgaged his own house to start a food bank out of his garage because he could see the need was so great. This is Tracy, who is the head teacher at the local primary school, where they lost all of their funding for the arts, nothing. And this is Sarah, whose family run a kitchen where they feed 200 people a day, 2 meals a day, 365 days a year out of the house. So these are the people who are catching the people who are falling through the austerity gaps. And each of them is on a note. And I spoke to Sarah when I was there. I said, "What does it mean to you to appear on one of these notes?" She said, "Well, when they first rang me up to tell me, I thought someone was winding me up, and I put the phone down. And it was only later when my counsellor rang me back and told me what was going on that I realised it was true." She said, "It's like Christmas. For us, this is like Christmas." So the idea is that the notes are in 5, 10, 20 and 50 denominations. They wanted to sell £50,000 worth of these notes. And half of that money would be distributed between these charities. And then the other half they wanted to take to the secondary debt market, which is this whole shadowy world that most people don't know anything about, which is where I had it when I got a parking ticket in Totnes, and I thought, and I felt really like aggrieved because I shouldn't have got it. And I thought, well, I'm just going to see what happens if you don't pay it. So first of all, you get all these snotty letters from the company who run the car park, and then those stop. And then you get much more aggressive snotty letters from another company you'd never even heard of before, and then they go and then they're going to threaten to see, "We'll see you in court, we'll see you in court," and then they stop. And then another load of start-up from another company who are really not very nice, who get shittier and shittier, and then they stop. And because what's happening is that they're selling those debts onto each other at less and less value every time. So most payday lending debt, which is what they were looking at here, is often sold on for as little as 2% of the face value to different companies. It was one of the reasons that the economy crashed in 2008, was because all this nonsense toxic debt that didn't really exist and was never going to get paid back was just bundled up and sold on and sold on and sold on. So the idea with this project was that they went to the secondary debt market with their £25,000. They bought 1.2 million pounds worth of Walthamstow payday lending debt, which is the debt that people on the lowest incomes get into most trouble with. And you basically buy a spreadsheet with everybody's names and addresses and how much they owe, whatever. So they bought this spreadsheet for £25,000, and then they wrote to all of the people on the spreadsheet and said, "Your debt is now cancelled. We don't expect anything in return. But actually, next week we are going to do an event where we have a van, which is symbolic of the debt, and we are going to explode this van as a symbolic detonation of your debt and as a kind of closing piece of our film." So at a place in London, within sight of a Canary Wharf, about 3 weeks ago, they blew this van up into pieces. And then the idea is that everybody who bought more than £50 worth of the bonds that they issued as well, they're going to get all the little bits of the car that are left over and melt them down into coins, into special commemorative coins. It's such a beautiful project. Like, yes, if you wanted to campaign against debt in your community, you could start a website campaign and do a petition, or you could do that. And that bank has been open like one evening every week as a place for people to come and learn about economics and how it works. Just beautiful. This is one of my favourite what-if questions from Belgium, where Transition Liège about 5 years ago said, what if in a generation's time the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? Beautiful what if question. It invites so many people to step in and say, I've got a bit of that puzzle, I've got something for that. And so I was there 5 years ago. I went to an event where they launched this, where they invited baristas and chefs and farmers and academics and anyone who cared about food. And then came back here. I didn't hear very much for the next few years. I went back last March, and in that time they'd started 21 new cooperatives. They'd raised €5 million of investment from local people. They started 2 farms, 2 vineyards, a brewery, which I had to go and visit. We have to make these sacrifices for the planet. This was the first of these shops they started, called Les Petits Producteurs, the small producers. The shop, they just took it over, painted it white. They put the food out in boxes from local farmers, tell the farmers stories, pay the farmers what they want. This is Pascal, who runs the shop. It's used for events in the evening, all sorts of different things. This way, it went so well after 6 months that they opened a second shop. That was doing so well, they've already opened a third shop. And it's just fabulous. Again, it was another of things like that town in France where I'm wandering around going, yeah, this is what I've been dreaming about and talking about for the last 12 years, and I can see it here. There's a local currency that ties through the whole thing. They have a pedal-powered delivery business that runs between them all. They have a seed cooperative. They have all these different stuff going on. It's just magic. And I said to Pascal, who manages the shop, I said, how far can this go? He said, I think by the time we have 10 shops, the supermarkets will start to fragilise. Beautiful word to have in French, fragiliser. We don't really have it in English, but it kind of works really, really well. The supermarkets will start to fragilise. Not we need to campaign against supermarkets and try and disrupt them and all that. We just build something better, and people step off onto the thing that's better. Just a beautiful project. So when I was in Liège, I met the mayor of Liège, who said, 8 years ago we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the story of the city, and we see our role as being to remove any obstacles that are in the way of this happening. All the land that we own around the city, we're now making. All the land they own, they had mapped in terms of soil quality, contamination aspect, what it would be best for, and then they offered it all to Ceinture Alimentaire and said, any young people who need land, they can use this land at low rents. So it's just amazing to see when the municipality gets that thing, that their role is to just get out of the way and just to allow this to kind of unfold. So, this might be the hardest question to imagine at this point in the British historic political history. What if our leaders prioritised the cultivation of imagination? What if we elected governments who, rather than always obsessing about innovation, focused on imagination instead? And there's a really important difference between those two words, because innovation is something you do when your fundamental model works. Imagination is something you do when that fundamental model is broken and you need to think of something else. And I always talk about it in terms of pizza. So pizza invites innovation because pizza works. We all understand the basic model of pizza. Pizza is great. We don't need to reimagine pizza. It's pretty simple, but you can innovate with breads and the flours and the toppings and the cheeses and all that kind of stuff. You don't need to reimagine pizza. Neoliberal growth-based economics is not like pizza. We have an economic system that is driving us headlong off a cliff, and when you're in that situation, innovation is really not what you need to focus on. You need to focus on making our collective imagination like a superpower, holding what-if spaces where people can come together to rethink everything. And how do we create the political context that enable that to be the case? So Brexit, I would argue, has been one of the greatest, most ruinous assaults on the national imagination. You ask a really complicated question in a yes or no way, polarises everybody. Nobody campaigned on if we left the European Union, we could do all this great stuff, it would be fantastic. It was none of that from either side, really. And but in Ireland, they've done it so much more maturely and sensibly by having citizens' assemblies, which is one of the demands of Extinction Rebellion. This is the ones they did for the same-sex marriage. They did the same thing for abortion. They've just done their one on climate change, which has led to the Irish government this week publishing its 2030 climate plan, which is just extraordinary, and tackling a lot of the things that seemed impossible to tackle in Ireland, like farming, for example. What's beautiful about this is it's one of many things that we call a deliberative democracy, where people come together to debate together and deliberate together and to come to mature decisions based on actually understanding the really complex matters and acting as if they're chosen like jury duty by sortition, So they come together like jury duty, not to argue their own personal perspective, but to act on behalf of all of their fellow citizens. It's very, very different. And it's one of, like I said, it's one of the demands of XR, but we should be using it for much, much more than just talking about climate change. This is Barcelona, where they have one of the best places I've seen for creating local democratic structures that really enable people, invite the imagination. So they have neighbourhood assemblies all across the city that arose out of the municipalist movement and what they call the fearless cities movement and what happened there, where city policy is informed by what comes out of the neighbourhood assemblies. And they underpinned with these idea of the feminisation of politics and this sort of very light transition on a city scale, resilience building stuff. But fundamentally, they changed the democratic structures. And how do you create the economic structures that invite the imagination? This is what they're doing up in Preston, where Preston City Council, in 2011, their whole economic model collapsed, which was, we're going to regenerate the city by building an enormous shopping mall. And that collapsed, and then they had to rethink. And so their idea is, again, very light transition. How do we design the economy so the money circulates as many times as possible? How do we use the key anchor institutions like the hospitals and schools and the universities to see them as anchor institutions, that their money circulates as many times within the city as possible? Started by doing a mapping of where all the money went that these anchor institutions spent, and they found that only 4% of that money was spent into the economy of Preston. So then they're now bringing their pension funds back to the city to drive different things. They're creating cooperatives to drive all these different new projects, energy and so on. So we can create a lot better structures for the imagination. And I was thinking, so where can we see places in the world where politicians are putting the imagination, not just putting mime artists on intersections, but actually using the imagination fundamentally to shift how we do things. This woman is called Gabriela Gomez-Mont, and she runs what is in effect the Ministry of Imagination in the Mayor of Mexico City's department. So her role, she said to me, imagination is not a luxury, and it's not just about designing cities that human beings can move around in, it's designing cities where the imagination can flourish. And they do a lot of that by saying, we've wasted far too much time trying to replicate Western development models. We need to be looking at all the stuff that we've already got here that's special to this place and building it off that. And they're doing some incredible stuff there. Her team, it doesn't look like it in this picture, but she said the team that she's assembled, half of whom are like planners and architects and people like that, and the other half are artists and photographers and filmmakers and playwrights. And that is the Department of Imagination. Their average age is 29. And this is in Bologna, where in Italy, where the municipality in Bologna created what they call a civic imagination office. And the civic imagination office sits between the municipality and the people, and it basically runs like a transition group. Every neighbourhood has a civic imagination office, which runs open space projects and generates people's ideas, works with people in big community meetings like this, big brainstorming projects, and then helps them to tease out ideas that are viable projects, and then creates what are called pacts with them. So the municipality says, we can bring some money, you can do it over there, we'll provide the logistical support, you agree to do this, we'll agree to do this, good, okay, off we go. And there are now 480 pacts that have been created over the last few years. It's been a key part of how the city allocates empty space and does new things as well. You know, it's beautiful, seeing a city where they put the imagination really in the heart of it. And what would it be like if we had a national imagination strategy? If we had a National Imagination Act, if we had a government who came and said, we need to put the imagination in the heart of everything. This is really, we're seeing an imaginative decline at the very worst possible time. We need to be focusing on all of that. How would you do that? Well, we have a really great model in Wales with this thing called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which was passed in 2015, and which says every public body has to set out how it's going to achieve sustainable development, not just talk about it, how it's going to achieve it, how it's going to act for the well-being of future generations. It has a beautiful redefinition of prosperity, which says that it's about the well-being of future generations, it's not about economic growth, it's about well-being and future generations. And you could easily take this as an act and say that every public body in the UK has to set out how it's going to maximise the imagination and how it's going to minimise the conditions that we know contract and destroy the imagination. So if you had an act like this, you wouldn't have been able to do austerity, because austerity is a direct assault on the nation's imagination. You wouldn't have been able to shut down so many libraries in this country. You wouldn't be able to bring in policies that eradicate the arts out of school. You'd have had something which is, it gives people a right to be imaginative. And that's something that I think would be a really essential step forward. So, my very, very last what-if question. What if all of this came to pass? What if we lived in a time when the imagination felt like it ran rampant through our culture? And I love this story from 2006 in London, where people woke up in London in May 2006. In Waterloo Place, there was this thing in the street. It appeared overnight, nobody knew what it was or where it had come from. It had smoke swirling all around it, and people started gathering around, and the police put incident tape all around it, and when people said, "What's that?" they said, "We've got no idea. It just happened in the night, we have no idea, we're waiting to hear." And the crowds grew and grew, and more people came to see this thing. And then the next morning, this big crane came and took the top off, and out of it came this girl, who was about the size of a 2-storey house. People said she was like everyone's daughter, and she would pick children up and give them a swing on her arms and bring them up and look them in the eyes, and just absolutely beautiful. And so she went walking around London. She went around London in an open-top bus. She slept the night in a deck chair in front of Buckingham Palace and had a shower in front of Buckingham Palace. And then the next day, this massive elephant arrived as well, with a sultan on the back. And the story kind of came out that the two of them travelled through time and space, and every now and then they would just meet each other. And that was all the story was. And it was the work of a French production company called Royal Deluxe and a company in London called Artichoke, who had taken them 7 years to get all the permissions in place to do all of this. It was extraordinary. It was 7 months or so after the 7/7 bombings, and it was the first time when everybody came really out into public very confidently. It was very, very magical. People were moved to tears by it. And at the end, she got back into her rocket, and they put the top back on the rocket, and all these flames came out, and they took the top off the rocket again, and she disappeared. And people were sort of in floods of tears watching it. Absolutely amazing. And it really struck me for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it brought a sense of awe. It brought awe into people's everyday lives. And there's amazing research about awe, that when people feel awe, they're much more generous and much kinder, and they really look out for each other much, much more. And also because I just loved that idea from the first picture of taking a place that people know really well and just changing it. And how do we bring, if there is a future ahead of us where that feels possible, that we could create, if we were able in the next 11 years to see an unprecedented, extraordinary mobilisation of resources and people and politics to transform things, how can we bring a taste of that into now so that people can see it and touch it and smell it? And this is a guy called Jason Roberts in the US, who runs a project called Better Block. And that's what Better Block do. They go, him and his wife toured around Europe and went to all these places, beautiful plazas and cafes and piazzas and fountains and stuff, and then went back to Houston and were like, this is a bit shit here, isn't it really? And there's none of that there at all. And went to this intersection where that was just horrible and unloved and all boarded up, and went through all the local bylaws which said that actually all the things that needed to happen there, you weren't allowed to do. So he said we created a pop-up weekend where overnight we transformed that space and we broke all the rules, and we typed out all the rules that we had broken and put them up on the walls all around and invited all the local government to come down. He said, "Wow, this is amazing, this is so great, you've done such a great job here." And then there on the walls were all the different laws that actually meant that nobody could, in theory, do that. So this is one of the projects, this is the kind of thing they do. They go to a place like this, and then they turn up overnight with things they've made, and they turn it into that. And I love that idea of how could we bring a taste of that and just arrive at places like how when you watch the Chelsea Flower Show and they have a space and then they work through the night with lights and then they create this thing and people arrive in the morning and there it is. How could you take a place that people know, a train station, a museum, and overnight you turn it into what we could create? And one small example of this is a thing that started in San Francisco, where artists started to say, how can we find affordable space to exhibit our work? All the galleries were really expensive. Finding space was really tough with gentrification. They were struggling. Then somebody said, "Well, do you know, when you go to a car, when you go to a car parking space and you buy a ticket for that space for the day, there's nothing that says you have to put a car in it. Actually, we can look at car parking spaces as being really affordable, low-cost rental space for artists. So every year they have a day called Parking Day where that's what they do. And they put the ticket, the only thing is you have to barricade off from the street and they take over parking spaces. They might do yoga in them, sometimes people get married in them, people create libraries in them, little cafes in them, sometimes people have them as a space that you might want to play games in. Sometimes people do whatever on earth that is, I've got no idea. But it's that idea of just taking spaces people know and giving them a kind of a makeover that brings the future in is something that I'm getting really curious and excited about. So, just to finish off, that's really what we do in transition for me. For me, it's been a really interesting new way of looking at the transition movement. We started here in 2006, and you now find transition groups in 50 different countries around the world, thousands and thousands of them. And the projects they do, whether they're small things like giving a talk or making wine in your street or holding events, or bigger things like doing a whole big street carnival, opening a shop, really ambitious things like starting a community co-housing project, starting a community energy company, all of those things, all those projects are really about taking a future that's tangible and possible and something that we could create and that meets all of our needs so much better than what's happening now, and you bring it into the present in a way that people can smell it and touch it and feel it and invest in it and interact in it and fall asleep in it and play in it and bring their kids to it. And I remember going to I think they're on here, Crystal Palace, Transition Crystal Palace created this amazing food market, which has won all the kind of food market awards in London. And I said to them, why do you do this? And they said, because we want our children to grow up thinking that this is normal. And that for me is really what this is all about. How do we bring that future we could still create, those memories of the future, bring them into the present and enable them to feel like they're normal. So I'm just going to finish off with one of my favourite pictures, which I took in Lyon, in France, driving through Lyon one evening, looked out the window and saw that and took this picture. And for me, this is, I love this, because somebody has done this little thing here and it just transforms that whole picture. Without that, it's just a boring street in Lyon on a Wednesday evening. There, for me, this is now like Romeo and Juliet. This is like the owl and the pussycats underneath a starlit sky. If the bin could be purring like a cat, we'd be hearing the bin purring and deeply in love. And actually all it's taken is just somebody making that little kind of intervention. It's not like we have to build an elephant the size of a 3-story house, or we have to completely remake everything instantly. But if we're skillful about it, we can start to make those tweaks and changes where we open up what-if spaces. We open up spaces where the imagination feels like it can intervene. And yeah, that's why I love that picture. That's me. Thank you very much. Okay. I think my advice or my suggestion would be that I always love the thing that Naomi Klein says, where she says there are no non-radical solutions left. You know, this is the time that we live in now where the only ideas that are of any value or merit are really bold and brave and creative and imaginative. And anyone who tries to shut down your ideas by saying that you need to be realistic, or anyone who tells you that your ideas need to you need to tone your ideas down because they're a bit too much, I wouldn't really pay them much attention, and have to have real faith and belief in what you're doing, and that this is a time when we need to be trying things out and experimenting and bringing play into what we do and bringing imagination into what we do. I would also suggest that imagination is something that is best done with other people, so to find people with whom you spark and create those kind of what-if spaces where you can really bound ideas around, and that nothing is as valuable as an idea that is then taken and tried out and played around with and experimented with. You know, for me, when we started doing the transition movement, if we were still sat around now talking about it and sharing books about things, we wouldn't have really got very far. You know, there was something very early on in the transition movement where we said, right, next Saturday we'll plant trees, you bring the spades, that kind of thing. And also to design into what you're doing the ability to support each other. So to have those expertise and those skills within your group where you're able to look after each other, have healthy groups that work well together, and and enjoy it, I suppose. Yeah, I've never met anybody who I taught permaculture who all transition who came back and said, do you know, I was doing really well before you taught me all that permaculture stuff, and since then my life just went down the tube. What bloody growing food stuff was just ruined everything. It doesn't happen. You know, there's something about this stuff that is rooted in a life culture that's really affirming and that feeds us and nourishes us in a way that we're meant to be fed and nourished, and that's what I always come back to.